Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What's your take on that view?
Yeah, I'd throw in lunch and dinner too as the only add-on. I couldn't agree more for me. They're very symbiotic, I will say that. In other words, when you're designing a strategy, it better represent the culture that's going to be able to help you execute it. They're very symbiotic with each other. They need each other.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. So you want to keep your employees engaged, avoiding burnout and other energy-sapping maladies. You want your people to provide memorable customer experiences regardless of the obstacles. You want to inspire high performance while optimizing profits, growth, and retention. Then you must do everything possible to ensure that your organization's culture is ready for prime time. An excellent guide is Eric Stone's Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, a roadmap for igniting high performance. After a 26-year career at Enterprise, the iconic rental car company where his teams consistently achieved top-level results, Eric founded Clear Path Ventures to help young professionals and businesses navigate their way to success. I'm delighted to have Eric as our guest for this episode. Eric, welcome to Leadership.
Rodger, thank you for having me on the podcast. Really excited to dig in.
Well, let's just jump right in here. In a nutshell, how do you define workplace culture?
I'll give you one of the shorter definitions, which you might appreciate. I just say behaviors in action. And it is, or you could say when there's no gaps in the values and the behaviors. And so what's interesting about culture, to me, is it really is truly the catalyst to executing the overall strategy. And one thing that's paralleled pretty nicely is when you think, Rodger, of personal branding, for example, it's what people say about you when we're not in the room. Culture is the behaviors that happen when leadership's not in the room. There's a little similar parallel between the two.
I can see that. And you say culture is the hidden engine of success for an organization. So why is it often overlooked by some companies and some leaders?
I think it's just misunderstood. I think people think it's soft and philosophical. I think they think it's all about high fives and hugs. And it is so not that. You can't see from the audience, but there's a couple lines I like to use about really what I think culture is, and it's high character with high standard. It's empathy with accountability, and I think it gets too much talk that it's just about the hugs and high fives. So and it's a buzzword. You go ask a CEO, tell me about your culture or define culture, and he'll crickets, or now how do you measure it? It's just this thing that I'd like to call it the shock absorber in every organization when you have this high performing culture, Rodger, because what it does is it's not even during the good times you need it. It really is actually during the difficult times that the culture really carries you through.
Sure. And we'll dig a little deeper later, but I love your phrase, empathy with accountability. There's a lot to tease out in that. So how can leaders know that their culture needs a jump start? What are the warning signs?
Well, I think the first part of that question is, how do they know? I think step one, the great leaders that I've witnessed have a presence. And what I mean by presence is they're almost omnipresent, whether they're kind of digging in virtually in person. They have an ability to be, maybe it's part of the training class, Rodger, and they have a setting where they open it up to the training class of 30 people. And you get to ask, are we living our values? How's your experience been thus far? What are we missing? What are those opportunities and challenges? And so, I think the really good leaders have a way to stay very close to that. I would also say they're great at looking for the artifacts. So what I mean by artifacts are those things that are special within an organization. It might even be a restaurant. You have these little slogans. You might have a championship belt for sales. Yeah, and they're proud that they have that belt. So when you don't see the belt being talked about, that might be a problem. When you have these flavors of the week, I mean, this is so popular in corporate America. Today it's Wednesday and it's all about sales, and then the next day we got this new initiative on sales, or the next day it's all about service, and they're very inconsistent with messaging. I think silos are really, really critical to avoid. There are times where you want, your head down, but I think when you're starting to see too much siloed, you get a little concerned about the culture. You usually tend to lack some innovation. So if you're an innovative company and you don't see too much going on, a red flag. Those are just a few things that you would want to keep an eye on. And I'd even throw in, Rodger, I was big on attendance. Let's say it's a summer picnic. We're in the summer now. Well, let's say it's a holiday party and you have poor attendance. Let's say absenteeism starts creeping in with your team. Those are absolute red flags that people are making a choice that it's easier maybe to call out or not show.
Right. So what does cultural alignment mean to you? And how can organizations assess if they are aligned or misaligned?
For me is when there's this consistency, there's this clarity. Every company lists their values, and I think the companies who do great are when they actually live the values.
Sure.
There are less distractions. I used to talk a lot about really making sure I could be the distraction catcher for my team. I wanted them to focus on the 3 to 5 key priorities that are aligned, that match our values. And so that was really, really important to me. A few exercises I always have companies do. Number one, for alignment is under each value, list 3 behaviors that represent that value that you're trying to portray through your organization. I think that's a really, really important thing to do. I would probably say that, the organizations who those 3 to 5 key priorities, they're tucked into the training. Again, everything in alignment. What my priorities are, I'm getting coached, trained, and developed with. And those are a few things that really what alignment means to me is this clarity that's in front of me. I know what is expected. When I do that, traction can follow. And with great traction, usually some good, consistent results and experiences happen.
You touched on something that I think is really critical, and that is to challenge people to talk about explicit behaviors that represent values. Most organizations, as you know, or at least many of them, talk about values, or they might have their values on a poster in the employee cafeteria. But when you start asking them, okay, what does this value look like in observable behavior? Be very explicit. And if you hear crickets, that's a warning sign. If they tell you specifically, okay, we talk about customer service, here are 3 examples that I've seen in the last 24 hours of excellent customer service, then people can start replicating that and they can internalize it, and then it starts to become natural. And that's what I think that's what you want with a culture.
I think you nailed a really important one, and that is for each value, I think it's smart that an organization looks at how are they going to recognize that effort and reward the excellence within it. And if you look at your values and you're never rewarding it, it's going to be hard for people to truly embrace. And so I think you're spot on for ensuring that you're rewarding that behavior.
So rewarding is excellent, and there are many ways to do that, of course, and it's certainly not all monetary. But what seems to be the key to getting employees so-called on board with a culture that produces consistently good results?
I talked a lot about, I guess it was a philosophy that seemingly was all the stats said if you can do these 4 or 5 things, you're going to have a great experience and engagement with your employees. I think when you can create, to get people on board, a strong relationship throughout. And so think of each one I mentioned of the 2 or 3 initiatives you're going to try to do within your organization. So when I say strong relationships, what do you do? Whether it's on the interview process, the training process, your field presence process, to create these strong relationships. What's the initiative that you encourage that talks about relationship building? I think the organizations who clearly communicate those goals and expectations, where everyone has a role and the job is to start in that role, usually is really important. That'd be the second. I'd go with having the right material and equipment in order to achieve the desired outcome for your team. Really so important when people you can't just say nowadays specific, Rodger, just do your job.
Right.
It doesn't work. You have to supply the pathway to get there in order to execute it. For the continued on board is personal and professional growth, I should say. Are you encouraging them to not just be great inside of that four walls you're in, but even are you going to let them take some of that magic home and learn about them personally? What are those things personally they're trying to accomplish too? And then the last is, we briefly touched about it, but it's the ability to recognize top performance. And I think if you could do some of those things and under each one, figure out within your organization, what are those initiatives that tuck under it, I think that's going to really help you pull people through.
Right. And celebrating excellent performance is always important. Now, employees, of course, are the lifeblood of an organization. How can leaders ensure that they are actively listening to and engaging with their teams to improve culture, rather than just pronouncing and talking and coaching, actively listening?
It starts with the leadership's ability to listen, observe, and learn, because actively listening is exactly that. You better be listening to what people are talking about. And so if I'm not doing it, it's going to be really difficult for others to follow my pathway. And so I think step one is, what are you going to try to do to create this listen, observe, and learn? And I mentioned initiative. I'll give you one that I loved. And it was as simple as a 30 minutes of fame, we called it. So we actually had a group of individuals, managers at the time, and this is back in my day at Enterprise. And we would bring these 6 to 8 managers who were nominated by their peers. So I didn't nominate them in. They did have to have good standing. I could rubber stamp or knock someone out. There had to be polite disagreement along the way. And they would come up and create an agenda with me on opportunities and challenges. And so I had to, step one, develop this think tank, we called it. But I had to actively listen to what was going on, because just because I felt something was going on, sometimes I was a little off. And I used that setting. Within the think tank, we generated an idea called the 30 Minutes of Fame. And what this was a way to personally understand how people are doing, but also professionally understand that we have expectations that go along with it. The first part of that 15 minutes was actively listening. The second half was really more of the business function of things, really talking about some of their performance and what they're trying to do to take their performance to another level. And so we had an initiative through our think tank to get buy-in from everybody. It wasn't my idea, it was our idea. And I think it encourages this actively listening throughout your organization.
Well, I'm sure that you've had to coach a lot of leaders on how to do that, because a lot of leaders, as you well know, have a tendency to want to jump in and solve something. They need to learn to bite their tongue and listen with their mouths closed. When they do that, and people realize that it's really okay to say whatever you're thinking in front of the boss, wonderful things can happen. You can get some things out on the table that need to be on the table.
Parenting is a great correlation to,
Sure.
Sometimes we want to solve our kids' problems, but that doesn't help anybody.
No. So how does, and I'm sure you've had a lot of observation experience with this, how does workplace culture impact employee retention and engagement?
So the way I look at it is, culture is this overarching thing that encompasses things like retention and engagement that are in it. So if in fact your culture is a strong culture that supports, you'll look at your retention and engagement, and that'll be a good barometer. Now with retention, it can be a little tricky, because I could stay with the company and I'm not literally and overly engaged. I could be lazy. I could be just going through the motions. And so you got to be careful a little bit on the retention side, but a good culture, of course, is a catalyst to retention. And usually engagement, if you can truly get people motivated and inspired, really about some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. To me, those are, if I were to say 6 things that were involved with the overall culture measurement, in a sense, engagement and retention are a huge piece of it. It really does tell a pretty good story. And so it is a few components of the overall culture.
And in today's economy and world and society, people don't tend to stay with companies as long as they did in previous generations.
There is no doubt that there is a shorter leash. I see it all the time. Listen, I have 11 nieces and nephews. I have 3 kids of my own. And as we know, everyone has their own circles of 5. And so we have a pretty close-knit group. And the majority of them all are in the workplace. And I hear stories all the time of their thought process about the company. Sometimes they're spot on and sometimes they're not. But there is no doubt that if you're not having consistent conversations, they will wonder, because this paradigm shift is they're not going to be as patient as someone like me who had some really tough days, but I still stayed for 26 plus years.
Yeah. So let's talk about measurements here. How can a company measure its cultural health, and what kind of metrics or KPIs should it be tracking?
I think there are so many folks trying to figure this truly out. I mean, I think that's the magic question. For me, there are really a handful of components. I mean, you can always do pulse surveys, engagement surveys, employee opinion surveys are really smart to periodically do. You just have to watch the survey fatigue in a sense.
Right.
I always look at half the battle. How is my customer's experience? Net promoter score, customer satisfaction, and how is my engagement number? To me, those are, if I had to weight out of 150%, I throw in that bucket. The other buckets are, how do I check in on my values and ethics within the company from an awareness piece to an execution and living these things? What is going on within my organization? Is there awareness of what are values, and are we staying true to being ethical? I think even though there's so much talk about the banning of diversity initiatives, you have to have a component where you're looking and saying, do we mirror the communities that we serve? Are we advancing people on a consistent basis? And you should, of course, keep an eye on either profits and or market share, depending on what your organization is really focused on. Some tenured organizations might be more on just some of the profits. Others might be concerned with market share. But if you look at some of those components, they're going to tell you a pretty big story. But I double weight the engagement, I double weight the customer experience. That is going to tell you everything you need to know about what's going on.
And I assume when you talk about customer experience, you're also talking about internal customers.
Yeah, really, there's 2 big things when I think of customers and things that people need to be doing is, sometimes you have someone who's referring you a customer. So you have, this account who refers you, and then you inevitably have that customer, but you also have vendors.
Sure.
Who are an important part. And instead of just walking on them and not being fair to them, they're a partner. And so vendors are a huge component of it. And so, yeah, there's this myriad on the customer side, from the person referring to the actual client potentially, to those that support your overall operation with the vendor lists.
Can you give us an example of a company, an organization that successfully turned around its culture? What key changes did they implement? How did they do it?
I'll share 2 examples, both a little different. One, and my nephew happens to work with them, Abercrombie and Fitch, was a Netflix special on the toxicity that was going on years ago. And they had to really look into their hiring process. They had to look into their store, how their mannequins appeared. They had to look at some of their cross-cultural communication training, bias training that was going in a wrong direction. And they did a really nice job of adapting to some really big holes, from the hiring process to even the locations process to the importance of bias training, cultural training. And I think that's been helping them move things forward, because they literally were a special on Netflix. I think the other unique one, and it's more of a reimagining, and I'm a huge sports fan, so I've been fascinated with this ride, is the Savannah Bananas. Now, they've reimagined what baseball is. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but when you look at their mentality of fans first, step one, Jesse Cole's their CEO.
Well, the name of the team itself is kind of fun.
All the teams that they have, they've created this league, and they've really reimagined baseball. To Jesse was a touch boring. I think he was actually a baseball player. And he is actually looking at their policies, procedures, quote unquote, the rule book, and trying to make it entertaining. And so he took a deep dive. I'll give you an example. There's no bunting with the Savannah Bananas. I think you're out if you bunt. If you get walked, I think you have to run to first base. If a foul ball is caught by a fan, the batter is out. And so he's reimagined how they have I think it's an intern program that you're with them for a couple of months and then they convert you in. So they really focus on this hiring the right individuals, making sure that they want to be there. And I've been fascinated with how they have really built this special thing. I've actually talked to a few people within the organization in that people and culture. I've been very impressed. They're growing like a weed, but they don't stay away from fans first. And they do everything, I believe, themselves. From ticket, I think they do their own ticketing, their own merchandising. It is a fascinating story, and it's amazing what happens when you make it fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Rodger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
So let's get into the entrepreneurial world a little bit here. How can smaller companies or startups with limited resources jumpstart their culture, especially when they're scaling so quickly?
I hear this a lot. I think number one, and depends how small you are, I was just always a fan of really creating these culture carriers to help you scale. These are those people like my think tank who are going to help you as you're scaling up. And so really whether it's a mentor program, a sought-out mentor, assigned mentor, reverse mentoring, whatever you can do to get all hands on deck, especially if you're a small company. I frame it as something called the hourglass that any company can do. And I use this visual because, number one, when you think of an hourglass, the word hour, O-U-R, is in it, not an eyeglass that I'm wearing right now. It's not an eye thing. And I know we're not on the video, but for those who think of an hourglass, and if you look at the top of any hourglass, I call it the discovery part of what you're trying to do, whether you're a startup or a tenured business. And this is where you're pulling. We talked about listen, observe, and learn from your people. You can always do that. It doesn't matter how big you are. And you're going to pull from stakeholders, board members, clients, employees, customers, as I said. And you're going to pull at the top of that hourglass. Now, as the hourglass bows out, you're getting all this feedback. You got to do something with it. So now you have to orchestrate something. As it bows out and gets bigger, you're trying to orchestrate what are those 3 to 5 key things with our startup we're really trying to focus on. And as you figure out what in fact that is, you know where the hourglass gets real narrow, sand comes through it?
Right.
Those are your 3 to 5 key priorities. That's where you're now going to roll that out to your team, whether it's 5 or 500. And then you got to do the reinforcement stuff. So as the hourglass now bows out, you have to do this training that we talked about, getting the message out. Do those 3 to 5 key priorities. Are they part of my training? Are they part of the review writing process where we're always talking about the same thing? And as you dominate that, eventually the sand hits on the bottom of that hourglass. And that's really where we talked briefly about is how you have to figure out how you're going to assess it as the hourglass has all the sand. How are you going to measure this? How are you going to measure how we're doing? Just when you think you have it, like startups, man, things can change really quick.
Sure.
Technology could come in. You turn the hourglass over and figure out throughout that process where you might be. The important thing with an hourglass, there's usually 2 pillars on each side that kind of support it. And you got to be mindful. On one side should be your policies and procedures, right? Those things that are going to guide your decision making. And on the other is the mission, vision, and values. And those are your kind of, as they all say, the North Star of how you're going to operate. And if you could think of a business like that, I think those would be helpful. But you can always tuck in those engagement factors, whether you're 5 people again or 500. It doesn't matter.
Seems like it's really important to be explicit about the kind of culture you want rather than just let it evolve.
I call it intentional, Rodger. You got to be
Sure.
extremely intentional about what you're doing. And, I mentioned before this distraction catcher that leaders must do. Sometimes we throw so much at our team, it creates this confusion. And I talk a lot about that great organizations have this way to communicate using this ABC approach, to keep it, to your point, intentional. And the A is really amplifying the message. What am I going to do to truly amplify the message throughout my organization? And think of how you're going to do that. You then got to decide, when do I have to buffer it, Rodger? There are so many things that get thrown at us.
Sure.
And just think of an email in length. Sometimes you get this soliloquy or a big document of an email when it could have been 3 sentences. And well, whatever it is, whether it's that policy and procedure that might have to be truncated a little bit, you got to be able to buffer the message to help them amplify the message. And then lastly is convey. We got to figure out when we're just going to nice to know, as ESPN calls them, your did you knows, not critical. I used to call them the sand items, those little things that you got to manage, but they're not critical. And I think all that can bring intentionality. And when you can buffer and convey, great. Your message is clear and amplify gets compounded.
Now, you say that adding is easy, but subtraction is smart. What does that mean in the context of culture?
Yeah, there is this famous phrase called complexity bias. And really what it says is people sometimes think that the more complicated something is, the more results we're going to get from it. And you can get very struck on this complicated model. And so the easiest thing is, there was a study, I think it was, someone did a Lego study. And they gave these engineers or architects, a bunch of Legos. And they said, hey, make this building better.
Yeah.
And of course, what do, Rodger? They add to the Lego set. And so you've got to find out a way to actually take a little air sometimes out of the basketball. I'll give you a small example. I actually was dealing with an organization, and I was looking at their promotional criteria. Really important for people to understand how we get promoted along the way. The problem is it was so complicated. I couldn't understand it. And I had to continue to if your people don't understand when they're ready, or if I can put in for this next opportunity, that's a problem. And they had I think it was 10 things that you had to focus on. And it was just too much. I mean, it's real simple to think about it, but we shortened it to 5 things that are the true drivers of what's going to happen. And that's just a small example of what you can do to truly subtract instead of always adding. Now, I felt you can start simple. It's kind of like a workout. If I have to work out for an hour and a half every day, I'm not likely to do it. If my workout, which mine is, it's 25 minutes, and I do it every day. And it's short, it's concise. I took away some things as I get older because I just can't do them. And so it's just this simple way of looking at it. I think Elon Musk calls it first principle thinking, kind of reimagining how something could look like. And we got to stop adding to things.
Well, you touched on this a little earlier, silos. To foster a more collaborative culture, what can leaders do to encourage open communication between teams and departments?
And this is so important because it happens a lot. Sometimes you have this specific department who's focused on this specific task. The one thing, and it's so simple, and it worked really well for me when I've done this, accounting and sales is a great example. Sales, they just want to sell, and they tend to think that accounting's the roadblock, and they keep needing this information, and why do they need this shell, and why do I need, and then accounting's frustrated because they're like, listen, we're putting these policies and procedures into place. Can you just follow them? And what I think is helpful is when you actually have the sales individual spend a few hours with accounting and observing some of the challenges that accounting truly faces because of their lack of detail And conversely, you have accounting go out in the field with the salespeople and see the pressure that the individual, the account they're trying to win over potentially, is pushing on them. And urgency matters, and we need to get things going. And I think that's just a simple way of cross-training that was always helpful. You got to understand what each party is dealing with and get a good perspective. And so I guess you could call it perspective training.
Well, sure. It reminds me, years ago, I was working with a senior team at a nuclear power station. And you don't mess around with policies and procedures at a nuclear power station. I mean, the margin for error is somewhere south of zero. But there were a couple of senior managers who couldn't stand each other. I mean, it was clearly open warfare. And the CEO was about ready to fire both of them. But he said, I really need both of them. They are highly skilled. We just need them to learn to behave better. And I said, well, would it be possible for them, for a short period of time, maybe a month, to switch jobs? Are they qualified technically to switch jobs? He said, yeah, they could do that. And I said, well, why don't you try it? So he did. They switched jobs. Now, they never did become fishing buddies, never did become best friends, but they started to talk. And the conversations would go, well, help me understand why you do this a certain way. They really started to understand what was going on in the other person's head and heart, and it made all the difference because they just talked to each other openly.
It's a great example, Rodger. And one of my favorite lines as you learn from people is just understanding someone's thought process. And as simply as saying, hey, tell me what's going through your mind, or how did we build it that way? I want to make sure I understand so I can follow it. And just sometimes doing that allows you to open up that dialogue that's so important.
Sure. So how can remote or hybrid teams maintain a strong workplace culture when face-to-face interactions are limited?
Yeah, this one, and I think everyone's still trying to figure this out.
Sure.
What is the best way to do this, knowing there's just less touch points, and how can I make those touch points really matter? As I said, I know a lot of folks coming right out of college through the network of my nieces, nephews, and kids, just that alone. And it is, I would go back to some of the ways of how will you do the relationship building. And you need to have this onboarding timeline type of thing. What's the first 6 months going to look like? Or what is a typical month going to look like? And let's manage some expectations so I know that if I need help, I know what route to go to. And so I don't know if you want to call them office hours. I don't know if the leader carves out a half hour every day for certain slots. I know you need to find ways, especially now where you might, I can be remote in Europe right now, and
Sure,
finding ways to bring people together that matter. But I only wish when I was in an executive with enterprise that I used more of the virtual setting things. I used an ability that if I wanted to be part of a morning meeting, all I have to do is now dial up. I actually think the good is there's so much more access for leadership to be really present. And so
Sure.
I just think you're going to have to really time out what is a typical week going to look like, month going to look like, quarter going to look like from a touch point that shows support but also empowers.
You use the term onboarding, which raises the question. In building a high-performance team, how can leaders hire for culture?
This one's so important because I think we'd all agree if you have great employees, if you have great talent, I hate to say this, but even if the training's not there, you're usually still pretty good. They're just so talented. Doesn't mean you don't train them. It just shows how important that hiring process truly is. And so I always say, and I call it like the hiring for that match. So step one, you've got to figure out what are those right questions that are going to allow me to hire the people who live the values and will demonstrate the behaviors on a consistent experience that are going to get the right outcomes. And so sometimes it's as simple as, we really redeveloped who's in the interview process, what are the questions we're going to ask. We actually were teaching our team truly how to interview. Not only how to interview, because what I found is people would ask a question but not have a chance for a clarifying question. We're not perfect in the interview process. I'm sure I had many issues along the way. But you have to ask a clarifying question to ensure that that person was going down the path you felt they were going on, because we get these, they call them halo and horn effects. All of a sudden, Rodger is a Red Sox fan, and I lower my guard a little bit. Huh. Or the horn effect. You mentioned that you might have the things to do at home, and that might affect your ability to work on weekends or something. And we just overlook it. Right. And so you really got to be patient. So right questions, clarifying questions. Do they truly know how to interview to hire for the right talent? And I think those are some things that I spent probably more time than I'd care to admit to ensure that we were doing the right things. And then, of course, the offer is so important too. When you get an offer and if 3 people end up reaching out to me and saying, Eric, welcome to, the CEO has a video message, the head of has a video message, Eric, we're so excited to have you, can't wait to onboard you. Those are things that why hiring for that right individual is so important. Rodger, I don't even know if this is technically legal. I have a lot of my nieces and nephews and kids. They tape the interview. I hear it. I hear how the interview goes, and we use it as a coaching tool. Yeah. And it is amazing of how many hiccups I've actually seen from the interviewer. This is all about match. It's not one-sided. And I can't believe some of the questions that were asked or the follow-up that wasn't there.
They can ask some pretty crazy questions, too. Yeah. If you could be an animal, what animal would you like to be? I mean, come on. Seriously.
And those are fun questions, and maybe they're icebreaker questions. I certainly hope just because I'm quick on my feet. Now, don't get me wrong. You need to be quick on your feet. Yeah. It really depends on what position you're trying to hire for. Some people it's like the NBA draft, NFL draft, a sports draft. Sometimes you hire this person and out of nowhere, they just blossom. And they blossom at a different time, because they needed a little bit more coaching and they were very coachable. And I think that's what, depending on your position, sometimes that's overlooked of how coachable is someone.
Yeah, if I recall, Tom Brady was not a first-round draft choice.
He was 199.
And he turned out okay.
Yeah, we'll take that.
Yeah. So what can leaders do to help employees avoid burnout while still fostering a high-performance culture?
There's 2 terms, and you use burnout, and I'll share you got to be careful of burnout. Burnout will normally, listen, people have lives. And so sometimes burnout is a combination of what's going on at home and maybe what also is going on within the workplace. And it usually stems from this overwhelmed feeling, and I don't feel supported. I don't feel I have the right training in order to do the things I want. I don't feel that they're responsive. And so those are the things that tend to kind of pop out on the burnout thing, which is why that training process is so important. I think on the bore-out side, don't underestimate that one either. These are people who might have high level of talent, high level of capacity, and maybe because they're remote, they don't have as many touch points, and all of a sudden they're losing the ability to really maximize what they're about. And so I think it is up to really a lot of the stuff we might have even talked about earlier is, are you clearly communicating with your team? Are you giving them the right training that they need to develop and some of those things? But I usually see the burnout is usually when they feel a bit overwhelmed, and why we talk about settings that are going to just sometimes say, Rodger, how are you?
Sure. Well, constant communication, really open, genuine, caring communication helps with a lot of things. There's no doubt about that. So, Eric, what can employees do to influence and improve their own team's culture when they are not in leadership roles?
I get this often. I get this question often. I mean, it starts with your own 4 walls. And so just because you're employee 3005, and you might work either isolated or in a small team, start by building where you are. Start by seeking others. I can't tell you how many times I'll randomly connect with someone on LinkedIn just to learn more about what they do. No one told me to do it, and how much better it allowed me to be. And so I really would recommend that don't just start with your 4 walls, but also build outward. And just because they're not with your company doesn't mean you can't learn something from them. There's so much out there in the world of leadership that whether it's a podcast like we got here, It's a book. It's a short YouTube clip. I mean, these are things that I always tell people. You got to continue to work on your own craft. Start with your four walls, though.
As you well know, Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What's your take on that view?
Yeah, I'd throw in lunch and dinner too, is the only add-on. I mean, I couldn't agree more for me. They're very symbiotic. I will say that. In other words, when you're designing a strategy, it better represent the culture that's going to be able to help you execute it. They're very symbiotic with each other. They need each other. But as I mentioned early on, Catalyst is that true execution piece. It is the catalyst too. It gets people excited. And that's what creates this special sauce.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Like a good garden, workplace culture requires mindful tending. We appreciate your ideas on how to keep the garden productive. To learn more about Eric and his work, go to clearpathventures.com. That's clearpathventures.com. And to grab a free copy of my book, Change Friendly Leadership, go to changefriendly.com. That's changefriendly.com. In other episodes of Leadership, I share my exclusive conversations with top thought leaders who offer smart tips to boost your effectiveness in both your professional and personal life. My guests include superstars like Stephen M.R. Covey, Liz Wiseman, Doug Conant, Heather Younger, Marshall Goldsmith, Amy Edmondson, Bill George, Jessica Chen, Guy Kawasaki, Dana Perino, Dave Ulrich, and many others who have insightful things to say that you can put to good use immediately. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay informed on what's coming your way. Trust me, folks, you don't want to miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Rodger Dean Duncan.